talked about the life cycles, the lifespans of fish, so let's look at seasonality. When we're going to be fishing for trout, we know that if we're fishing in the fall, we might run into some aggressive brown trout that are getting ready to spawn. When we're fishing in the spring, same thing, we might run into some rainbow trout that are about to begin their spawn. But what about when we want to fish in just the summer months or in the winter months? What does this seasonality mean in terms of fly fishing? Well, the cool thing is you can actually fly fish year-round. Depending on where you are, even in some of the coldest states, you can still fly fish. I love to go fly fishing in the winter, but it's a very different experience than fly fishing in the summer. As a beginner, if you're learning to fly fish, I'd highly recommend fly fishing in the summer. This is because there's a lot more insect life, there's a lot more hatches, fish are a lot happier because they're not so cold, they're going to be more energetic. It's a great time to learn fly fishing because you're going to have more success in catching fish. During the wintertime, trout are not nearly as active as they are other times during the year. During this time of year, they're typically in a mode of somewhat of hibernation. They will still feed, but for the most part, they're most interested just in conserving their energy. If you go fly fishing in the winter, you have to know that you're most likely going to have some slower days. Even though there are fish, the fish are not going to be nearly as active or interested in feeding. Another topic related to seasonality that I want to bring up is runoff. That's a common term used in fly fishing, and what runoff means is it's a time during the year, in the springtime, when all of our rivers are flooded with snow melt. So all of the runoff, the snow melt that is melted up in the mountains high above, is coming into the rivers and essentially flooding our rivers. This is great. We love runoff. It's wonderful for the environment, for the rivers, for everything. But it can definitely make fishing a little bit different, well, a lot different and pretty complicated. Guides will still guide during runoff. Fishermen will absolutely still fish during runoff. But again, as a beginner, I'm not sure I would recommend going fly fishing for the first time during runoff. There's a few reasons why. Runoff typically happens mid-May to either end of June, sometimes mid-July. During this time, the rivers look very different, and it can also be pretty dangerous. Water levels can be high, currents can be fast. This is probably the most dangerous time to go fly fishing. If you are going to fly fish during runoff, make sure that you're with somebody and that you're being extremely cautious. Fly fishing during runoff can be complicated because everything is different. You can't see the structure in the river. It might look like just a massive flood at some time. So how do you fish it? How do you know where the fish are? The answer is the fish can be anywhere during runoff. Oftentimes during runoff, because the water levels are high, the currents are strong, fish tend to gravitate more towards the banks. A lot of the time during runoff, I'll see trout sitting right on the edge of the bank. They hold out in these areas because they can withstand the current and still find some food. Hatches can also still occur during runoff, but again, because the rivers are so out of whack and they look very different, a lot of the times trout are just kind of eating what they can find. Trout can't see very well during runoff because the water is so high that it's pulling in a lot of mud and dirt from the banks, making the water look brown and murky, and it's very hard for trout to see. This can be hard for fishing, but also good for fishing. Sometimes you can get away with throwing a lot of different types of flies and fish will still eat it because it's hard for them to be able to see it. It's not so great for fishing because sometimes the fish simply can't see your flies. So it is pretty lucky when a fish can see it during runoff and you do hook a fish. Another tip for runoff is because the water levels are high and bringing in a lot of dirt and insects and mud from the bank, they also bring in a lot of worms. When I fish worms, I think the best time to do this is during runoff. So I have flies that look like little worms because again, think about the water pulling the mud in from the bank. It's pulling in worms. And oftentimes you can get worms that are really bright in color, like bright pink, bright red, dark purple, and these are easy for fish to see during runoff. So if you're not having much luck using some of the things that we talked about, like the dry flies or the streamers or the nymphs, use something brighter in color during runoff. Try a bright colored worm or possibly even a bright colored bead. With winter fishing, it can be more complicated, but remember back to what I said when we were talking about the life cycles of different insects. Remember the one insect that does hatch year-round, that's the midge fly. So if you are going to fish in the winter, think about midges being a great option to use during this time. Another thing about midges compared to stoneflies, caddis, mayflies is that midges can do really well in areas that are not clean and oxygenated. We often find midges in swampy areas, lakes, as well as rivers and streams.